Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the legislative process and the comparative powers of the House of Commons and House of Lords in A-level politics. So that's not just all the knowledge you need to know with some really key specific examples, but also key points of analysis that you could use in your essays, as well as some really likely questions that you could get asked in the exam so that you can be fully prepared for your exam. The PDF you should be seeing up there, you can access in the first link in the description to the Politics Explained website, where you can also find a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in, as well as a lot of other resources, including essay plans and these kind of everything you need to know guides to help you in your politics A-level. So this video is going to start by looking at the kind of potential essay questions and key debates you could get asked about. I'm then going to go into the legislative process. From there, I'm going to look at the comparative powers of the House of Commons and House of Lords, finishing off with a kind of debate between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So yeah, let me know any questions you've got in the comment section below. Without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the parts of the specification this lesson covers. So this is part of the Parliament topic, and it's 2.2 and 2.3. So first one is the comparative powers of the House of Commons and Lords, and the second one is the legislative process. The reason why I've kind of put them in together in one video is they really kind of have a lot of shared content and work well together. And in terms of the key debates you can get asked about in the exam on these topics, you can get asked about whether Parliament carries out its legislative function effectively. You could be asked about the power balance between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And you could also get a question just on the House of Lords, in which you'd need to use your knowledge from the Constitution topic and other parts of the Parliament topic as well. If you make detailed essay plans on the questions in bold below and kind of use them to kind of practice and answer other questions as well, you should be well prepared for the exam. And these will also soon be available to purchase on the Politics Explained website. So yeah, in terms of key kind of questions you can get asked, you've got to evaluate the view that Parliament performs its legislative role effectively, evaluate the view that the House of Lords is an effective check on the power of the House of Commons, and evaluate the view that the House of Lords is in need of major reform. But now going on to the content, so starting off with the legislative process and starting off with the different types of bills. So the first key way to kind of divide up bills is public versus private bills. So public bills are the vast majority of bills, and they're bills that affect the entire population, including both government bills and private members' bills. And just to clarify, bills are effectively laws before they get voted on, right? Before they become laws. So they're kind of proposed laws. And the majority of bills are public bills, but you've also got private bills, which only affect only organisations, such as local authorities and companies, or only affect kind of particular individuals, and give them powers that are beyond or in conflict with the general law. So private bills only change the law as it applies to specific individuals or organisations, rather than the population as a whole, and often come as a result of organisations or individuals lobbying the government directly. So for example, the University of Manchester Act 2004 facilitated the merger of two existing Manchester-based universities. So that's kind of one way to divide up bills. Potentially the more important way is to divide it between government and private members' bills. So all of these government and private members' bills are public bills. So as the government controls the majority of the parliamentary timetable, most bills are government bills. So these are piloted through the legislative process by ministers and seek to fulfil manifesto commitments or the government's more general agenda. There are also private members' bills though, which are introduced by backbench MPs and offer a way of legislating on important issues without dividing parties. There have been notable pieces of legislation that began as private members' bills, including the Abortion Act of 1967, which legalised abortion, and the Assault on Emergency Workers Act of 2018, which was introduced by Labour MP Chris Bryan. Private members' bills have little chance of getting passed unless they are backed by the government though, whilst they are very susceptible to filibustering as there's little time in the parliamentary calendar for them. There are three different ways for private members' bills to be introduced. The first and kind of most likely having success is through a ballot. So MPs who want to propose a private member's bill enter a ballot at the start of every parliamentary session. 20 MPs are chosen at random, and they are then able to propose a bill on one of the 13 Fridays in the parliamentary session. These are the most likely to succeed, as more time is allocated for them in the parliamentary calendar. The second way is 10-minute rule bills, which allow a backbench MP to make their case for a new bill in a speech lasting up to 10 minutes. There can be an opposing speech before the House of Commons decides on whether to introduce the bill. If it is successful, then the bill is given a first reading. These bills are unlikely to progress further, though, as they aren't given priority in the parliamentary calendar, which is dominated by the government. And they're often just used to criticise current legislation. And the final one is presentation, when MPs simply introduce a private member's bill but don't speak to support it. These very rarely succeed. So the first two are the main ways that they succeed, particularly through the ballot. So now looking at how a bill becomes a law and the different stages. So before a bill enters the House of Commons stages, they go through a consultation stage. This starts with a consultation, a green paper, which then may be turned into a firm proposal, a white paper, on which committees comment before the bill is eventually drafted. So in what order do bills go through the Commons, Lords and Crown? So the Crown is the monarch. If a bill starts in the Commons, it goes through the Commons first, then the Lords, then back to the Commons to approve the Lords' amendments, and then to royal assent, providing the amendments are accepted. If it's the same if a bill starts in the Lords, but the Lords and Commons are switched. So go through the Lords first, then the Commons for some amendments, and then back to the Lords. And if those amendments are accepted, then it's passed and goes to the monarch. The vast majority go through the House of Commons first. So what stages does a bill go through in the Commons before it goes to the Lords? So the first thing it has is a first reading, where the bill is formally introduced to the House of Commons by a minister. A date is set for the second reading, and the bill is printed up ready for the second reading. The second reading is when a minister outlines, explains, and justifies the proposal and deals with general questions. The principles of the bill are discussed, and contested by backbenchers and shadow ministers. If a bill is contested at this stage, there is a vote that the government almost always wins. Then it goes to the committee. So this is the third stage, the committee stage, when it's sent to a public bill committee, a separate one of which is formed for each bill. So the bill is scrutinised in detail and amended. And public bill committees range in size from 16 to 50 MPs and reflect the party composition of the House, so will have a government majority in them. For especially important bills, especially finance bills, this scrutiny is done by the whole House of Commons, for example, the recent illegal migration bill. Then it goes to a report stage, when MPs can propose and vote on amendments on the floor of the House. The amendments that are suggested at the committee stage are also voted on. And then finally, you have a third reading. So there's no major amendments at this stage. The bill as a whole is looked at and debated before kind of being voted on by the House of Commons and passed or rejected. So once that's passed, it goes to the House of Lords, where effectively it has a very similar process. So it has a first reading, it has a second reading, which are effectively the same. Then it has a committee stage. So in the Lords, this is normally done in the chamber as a committee of the whole House. So the bill there is scrutinised in detail and amended. Then you have a report stage, same as the House of Commons, right, where peers can propose and vote on amendments on the floor of the House, and a third reading. So if the bill is passed, it moves towards royal assent, and if it is rejected or significantly amended, then it returns to the Commons for consideration, going through all of the common stages again before returning to the Lords. What I'm going to look at now is the interaction between the Commons and the Lords during the legislative process. So, what is the key role of the House of Lords in the legislative process? The House of Lords recognises its lack of democratic legitimacy and therefore doesn't seek to exert all of the powers it possibly could do in the legislative process. Instead, it sees its role as offering technical amendments to improve and fix bills, as well as taking a stand against a bill when it feels it is justified. For example, in terms of protecting rights or halting a bill that has garnered a huge public backlash and has limited public support. If the House of Commons offers amendments which are then rejected by the House of Commons, the House of Lords does then often accept its lack of democratic legitimacy and backs down. So, for example, the EU Withdrawal Act of 2020 was sent back to the House of Commons with 5 amendments, including one guaranteeing the continuance of the Erasmus scheme. However, the House of Commons rejected all of these amendments and the Lords backed down, recognising the lack of democratic legitimacy, recognising the greater democratic legitimacy of the House of Commons and the democratic legitimacy of Brexit. So, if the House of Commons, if the House of Lords doesn't accept the Commons amendments, what you can have is parliamentary ping pong. So this is when, if either House makes amendments to a bill, the other House must consider them and agree to them before a bill is passed. If they fail to agree to them and make alternative proposals, then it must go back to the other House to be voted on again. Bills can go back and forth between the House of Lords and House of Commons, before both houses reach agreement on the working of the bill, and that's known as parliamentary ping pong. A good recent example of this is the 2021 Trade Act, which established the Trade Remedies Authority. The House of Lords sought to introduce an amendment, supported by some in the Commons, to prevent the UK governments from agreeing to trade deals with other countries that had committed genocide, which the courts would decide whether genocide had been committed. The bill was introduced in the Commons in March 2020 and the Lords in July 2020. After this, it went back and forth between the two houses 6 times before receiving royal assent on the 29th of April 2021. The House of Lords eventually backed down on its amendment. So that shows how it can go back and forth consistently before it's eventually passed. So now looking at some key things that limit the House of Lords. Firstly, looking at the Salisbury Convention. So the Salisbury Convention means that the House of Lords shouldn't block any bill that fulfills a pledge in the government's election manifesto by voting against it in the second or third reading. The Lords can offer technical amendments, but can't introduce wrecking amendments, which change the government's manifesto intention as proposed in the bill. The Lords must also give the Commons reasonable time to consider amendments and pass the bill. So there is disagreement within the Lords as to whether the Convention should still apply during coalitions and minority governments, and it's largely been left up to individual peers to decide, though it's caused fewer problems as may have been expected, as the Lords rarely blocks government proposals anyway. So that's a key limitation on the legislative power of the Lords, because it plays very little role and can't block legislation that was included in the government's manifesto. A key piece of legislation, or two key pieces of legislation, that limit the House of Lords are the Parliaments Acts of 1911 and 1949. So the 1911 Parliaments Act was passed following a crisis over the budget. It had been a convention that the Lords didn't interfere with matters of taxation since the 17th century. However, they did in 1909 when the Liberal government tried to introduce new taxes on land and wealth, causing a constitutional crisis. The Act gave the House of Lords no right to delay financial bills, and its previous power to veto non-financial bills was replaced by a delaying power lasting 2 years. So before this, it had a complete veto and similar powers to the House of Commons. Now, in the Parliaments Act of 1911, that was really reduced. They can't offer wrecking amendments to financial bills, and in relation to other bills, they only have a delaying power of 2 years. This delaying power was then reduced to 1 year in the 1949 Parliaments Act after the Lords opposed the Iron and Steel Nationalisation Bill, including the Attlee's Labour Manifesto. So those two key things, the Salisbury Convention and the Parliaments Act, are really key things to remember and really key ways in which the Lords is limited. Next, going to look at secondary legislation. So bills which turn into acts of parliament are known as primary legislation. So that's most of the legislation we looked at so far. These acts empower ministers to make further changes or regulations within the scope of the law after it has become law. So within laws, there's also variation and further powers that empower the government to make those small changes. So these regulations are known as secondary or delegated legislation, and can be changed by ministers using statutory instruments, around 3,500 of which are introduced a year from all areas of government legislation. For example, statutory instruments are used to ban new substances by adding them to a list under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, rather than passing a whole new piece of primary legislation completely. In 2016, the government abolished maintenance grants for university students using secondary legislation, showing that really significant changes in people's lives can be made by statutory instruments. So statutory instruments are scrutinised by the Select Committee on Statutory Instruments, which considers whether they should be drawn to special attention of Parliament. The majority of statutory instruments are made law by ministers and automatically become laws unless objected to by Parliament, which is very rare. So very little parliamentary scrutiny, and Parliament plays very little role in secondary legislation. It's mostly controlled by the government. So final thing we're going to look at before looking at the comparative power of the two houses is how the House of Commons legislative scrutiny has decreased in recent years. So MPs spend a lot less time in the House of Commons debating legislation than they used to. MPs spent just 24% of their time in the chamber between 2006 and 2021, compared to 44% of peers. So Parliament can therefore be seen as relying on the House of Lords for scrutiny. Just 27% of bills in the last 5 parliamentary sessions were subject to an oral evidence session at the committee stage, in which the committee calls in expert witnesses to give their views on the legislation. So that can be seen as decreased kind of effectiveness and detailed scrutiny of government bills. And only around 10% of government bills passed by Parliament receive pre-legislative scrutiny when they're green or white papers. So especially in recent years, many bills are rushed through Parliament and receive little scrutiny from the House of Commons, as the Brexit process and COVID-19 set precedents for legislating quickly and avoiding scrutiny. The government has given the recently introduced illegal migration bill just 2 days in the Committee of the Whole House, for example. And this compares, for example, to the 2016 Immigration Act, which had 15 committee sessions and received 55 written pieces of evidence. So a lot more scrutiny of legislation. Okay, so that was the legislative process, 2.3 of the Parliament topic. What I'm going to look at now is the comparative powers of the House of Commons and House of Lords, which is 2.2. And this is the part of this video that's more likely, in my opinion, for there to be asked a question on. So, starting off by looking at the exclusive powers of the House of Commons. The first of these is bringing down the government. So one key power held exclusively by the House of Commons is that they can hold a vote of no confidence and therefore bring down a government if the government loses, as they're forced to resign. The last time this happened was in 1979, when nationalist parties that were upholding a minority Labour government in a confidence and supply agreement withdrew their support, which brought down the Callaghan government and triggered the 1979 general election. This kind of links into the next exclusive power of the House of Commons, and that's forming a confidence and supply agreement. So the House of Commons has the exclusive power to uphold a minority government through a confidence and supply agreement. This is when one of the Conservative or Labour parties doesn't have a majority and doesn't get a majority through a formal coalition, such as the 2010 coalition was. Instead, it gets it through a limited agreement with another party or parties that agree to keep them in government. The supporting smaller parties promise to support the government in a vote of no confidence, that's the confidence part of confidence and supply, and to vote through the government's budget, the supply part. In return, they receive some concessions. So in 2017, for example, the Conservative minority government used a confidence supply agreement with the DUP, Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, in which the DUP agreed to support the Conservatives in votes of no confidence and over budget in return for £1 billion of money pledged to Northern Ireland. So that's the kind of concessions that could be offered. I think in I don't know when the government was brought in, maybe 1976, 77, and when there was that confidence supply agreement between Callaghan and the minority parties, between Labour and those nationalist parties, I think one of the key concessions they had was having devolution referendums, which were rejected, which is actually a key reason why that confidence supply agreement broke down in 1979. So, next thing is forcing through legislation. So if the House of Commons refuses to change its position and pass a bill supported by the House of Commons, the House of Commons can, as a last resort, invoke the Parliament Act of 1949 after a year to force a bill through. This was used 3 times by the Blair government, but hasn't been used since and has only been used 7 times in total. So under Blair, it was used to change the voting system for EU Parliament elections with the European Parliamentary Elections Act of 1999. It was used to equalise the age of consent to 16 for homosexuals and heterosexuals with the Sexual Offences Act of 2000, and it was used to ban hunting with dogs with the Hunting Act of 2004. And then finally, a key kind of exclusive power of the House of Commons is to pass financial or manifesto legislation, which is kind of, we looked at a little bit already with the Salisbury Convention and the Parliament's Acts. So the Salisbury Convention means that the House of Lords shouldn't block any bill that fulfills a pledge in the government's election manifesto by voting against it in the second or third reading. The Lords can offer technical amendments, but can't introduce wrecking amendments, as we went through. And the Parliament's Acts of 1911 and 1949 prevent the House of Lords from delaying financial bills. So that was the kind of exclusive powers of the Commons. What I'm going to look at now is the main powers of the House of Lords. So the first one of these is forcing a general election after 5 years. If the government seeks to stay on beyond 5 years without a general election, then the House of Lords has the legal power to force a general election. This hasn't happened yet, but it can be seen as quite an important democratic power. Secondly, scrutinising and revising legislation, especially in recent years when the government has increasingly rushed legislation through the House of Commons. The House of Lords has played a crucial role in scrutinising and revising legislation, as the government has less control over the parliamentary timetable in the House of Lords. So the House of Lords frequently offers technical amendments to improve and fix bills and is sometimes called an amending chamber. The government and the House of Commons accept most of these amendments. And then finally, delaying non-financial legislation. So though the House of Lords often backs down if its amendments are rejected by the House of Commons, sometimes it doesn't and takes a stand against a bill when it feels it is justified. This is often to protect human rights or in relation to a bill that has garnered a significant public backlash or has limited public support. The delaying power can be very significant in influencing legislation, especially in emergencies when the government want to pass laws quickly. So, for example, in 2001, 10 defeats in the House of Lords led the government to remove incitement to religious hatred as an offence from its anti-terrorism legislation. The House of Lords, this was because the House of Lords didn't back down and argued that it would have threatened human rights. Now, final thing going to look at before looking at the debate between the relative power of the two houses is the growing power and assertiveness of the House of Lords. Starting off with how the House of Lords has become more representative. So following New Labour's reforms, the House of Lords is no longer dominated by hereditary peers. Instead, it is dominated by life peers who are there primarily as a result of their expertise and experience. It is also becoming increasingly socially representative, as efforts have been made to appoint more women and ethnic minority peers. Following New Labour's reforms, the House of Lords also no longer has an inbuilt Conservative majority, with the crossbenchers ensuring that no single party can get a majority. This leads to greater scrutiny than in the House of Commons. Currently, there are 260 Conservative members, 184 crossbenchers, and 173 Labour Party members, kind of clearly showing that no party has close to a majority and how it's kind of more representative and independent. Secondly, the House of Lords has become more professional. So since New Labour's reforms, the House of Lords has become a lot more professional. So many life peers are ex-professional politicians who are able to provide leadership in the House of Lords and experience in parliamentary scrutiny. So Lord Andrew Adonis, for example, is a Labour peer who served as Secretary of State for Transport under Gordon Brown. Many life peers are specialists from different fields who can provide expertise on specific areas. So Baroness Brown of Cambridge, Julia Elizabeth King, for example, is an engineer and a crossbencher. She is the current chair of the House of Lords Select Committee on Science and Technology, kind of showing how her expertise outside of the House of Commons and her specialism allows her to provide effective scrutiny in relation to science and technology. And then finally, after the passage of the Human Rights Act in 1998, civil liberties has become a more significant part of UK politics. As the Lords has many lawyers and human rights experts, it can be seen itself it kind of often seen itself as the guardian of civil liberties, shown in their 2008 opposition to Labour's anti-terrorism legislation. So, finally, the House of Lords has become more independent of the executive and effective at scrutiny. So, especially since New Labour's reforms, the House of Lords has become more independent and assertive in scrutinising the work of government. As peers aren't elected, they don't need the party machine or party funding to help them remain in post at another election. Therefore, there's less pressure on them to vote along party lines, and whips have little bargaining power. This leads to governments being defeated a great deal more in the House of Lords than they are in the House of Commons, especially when the government has a massive majority, in which case the Lords becomes the effective opposition. Tony Blair, for example, was defeated just 4 times in the House of Commons, all of which were in his last term, but was defeated 353 times in the House of Lords. Since the 2019 election, Boris Johnson was defeated 4 times in the House of Commons, but 243 times in the House of Lords, which was kind of an unprecedentedly large number given the short amount of time he was in power. The House of Lords also has more time, energy, and expertise to devote to scrutinising government policy and legislation line by line. So, for example, the 2020 Agriculture Act received 32 hours of scrutiny in the House of Commons, but 96 hours of scrutiny in the House of Lords. So finally, just giving an example of how the House of Lords kind of exerts its kind of main powers and is quite independent, is the 2018 EU withdrawal bill introduced by Theresa May, which is a good example of how the House of Lords can be effective in challenging legislation when the government is weak, and some members of the House of Lords, some members of the House of Commons, support the amendments. In June 2018, the May government suffered 15 defeats in the Lords in connection to the EU withdrawal bill, with one amendment seeking to prevent Britain leaving the customs union and another ensuring Parliament would have a meaningful vote on any withdrawal agreement reached with the EU. So 6 were defeated in the Commons, 1 was accepted by the government. That was making sure that under law, the UK would be able to copy new EU laws passed after the UK's exit and to participate in EU agencies if it chooses. And the other 8 saw some form of compromise, conceding that a meaningful vote would have to be held and there would be no hard border on the island of Ireland. So that shows the kind of balance, how to some extent they're able to kind of challenge legislation and change legislation, but in other ways they aren't, because the Commons rejects their amendments. Okay, so the final thing I'm going to look at is the debate over the relative power of the two houses. And I've split this up into 3 different sections, which you could use as paragraphs in your essay. So the first of these is power over legislation. And the arguments that the House of Commons is more powerful looks at how the Parliament Act can be used to force a bill through if the House of Lords kind of seeks to reject it. The House of Lords is also limited in the legislation it can vote down and play a role in, whilst the House of Commons isn't. So the Salisbury Convention prevents the House of Lords blocking any bill in the government's manifesto, and the Parliaments Act prevent the House of Lords from delaying financial bills. And finally, even when the House of Lords votes against legislation or attempts to significantly amend it, it often backs down when the House of Commons disagrees or votes against these amendments, recognising its lack of democratic legitimacy. On the other hand, arguments that the House of Lords is more powerful is that though the House of Lords often backs down if amendments are rejected by the House of Commons, sometimes it doesn't, and it takes a stand against a bill when it feels it is justified, often to protect human rights or in relation to a bill that has garnered significant public backlash or has limited public support. Secondly, the delaying power can be very significant in influencing legislation, especially in emergencies when governments want to pass laws quickly. And finally, when the government has a large majority in the House of Commons, it's very unlikely to be defeated. Whereas by contrast, especially since New Labour's reforms, the House of Lords has become more independent of the executive and more assertive in scrutinising the work of the government. This leads to governments being defeated a great deal more in the House of Commons than they are in the House of Lords, than they are in the House of Commons, especially when the government has a massive majority, in which case the Lords becomes the effective opposition. So when the government has a massive majority, it can be argued that the House of Lords is more effective and has more power over legislation because the House of Commons so infrequently rejects government bills. The next thing to look at is scrutiny. So arguments that the House of Lords is more powerful in terms of scrutiny is that especially in recent years when the government has increasingly rushed legislation through the House of Commons, the House of Lords has played a crucial role in scrutinising and revising legislation, as the government has less control over the parliamentary timetable in the House of Lords. The House of Lords frequently offers technical amendments to improve and fix bills and is sometimes called an amending chamber. Since New Labour's reforms, the House of Lords has also become a lot more professional and has significant expertise, which allows highly effective scrutiny of government legislation. The House of Lords also has more time, energy and expertise to devote to scrutinising government policy and legislation line by line. The House of Commons, by contrast, spends little time scrutinising government legislation, with the fact that MPs are whips and public build committees reflecting the balance of the House, and therefore the fact, if they reflect the balance of the House, they have a government majority, that can be seen as limiting the effectiveness of House of Commons scrutiny of legislation. On the other hand, arguments that the House of Commons is more powerful are that the House of Commons can be seen as providing more effective non-legislative scrutiny in a number of ways, including select committees, ministers' questions and debates. Look at the video on the Politics Explained YouTube channel on parliamentary scrutiny and the interaction between the government and Parliament for that, for more detail on that. Secondly, the democratic legitimacy of the House of Commons the House of Commons legislative scrutiny leads to it being more effective, whilst it also has the executive power to vote down financial legislation and legislation included in the government's manifesto. And finally, it can be argued that public bill committees in the House of Commons do provide effective scrutiny. They can call expert witnesses, and they often devote significant time to scrutinising legislation. And then finally, looking at the key non-legislative powers of both chambers. So arguments that the House of Commons is more powerful is how they can hold a vote of no confidence and bring down a government if the government loses support. The House of Commons also has the exclusive power to uphold a minority government in a confidence and supply agreement. On the other hand, arguments that the House of Lords is more powerful is that the government, if the government seeks to stay on beyond 5 years without a general election, then the House of Lords has the legal power to force a general election. So yeah, that's everything in terms of the content. I'm going to quickly now go back to some of the essay questions and just have a quick talk about how you could potentially structure answers to them. So evaluate the view that Parliament performs its legislative role effectively. This one is quite difficult and you probably need to combine it with other parts of the Parliament topic, Potentially what you could do is look at private members' bills as one paragraph, how effective they are at being passed. So how effective Parliament is at passing legislation without the government. Then you could look at scrutiny of legislation in the House of Commons in terms of how effective it is at that. And then you could potentially, and in that you could bring stuff in about kind of how well how the government has recently rushed through legislation. And thirdly, you could potentially look at the role of the House of Lords and how effective it is at kind of helping to pass legislation. That's not to say that's the only way you can answer that. There's lots of different ways, but as I said, that's probably quite an unlikely question as well to be asked. Next one, evaluate the view that the House of Lords is an effective check on the power of the House of that the House of Lords is an effective check on the power of the House of Commons. For that one, I'd probably use those three different headings we just went through, right? So scrutiny of the government, power over legislation, and other kind of key non-legislative powers. And then evaluate the view that the House of Lords is in need of major reform. For that one, you definitely need to compare it with other parts of the Parliament topic and the Constitution topic as well. Just some ideas of things you could include from this video. In that, you could potentially include arguments that they should have more powers, or because the government can effectively force through a lot of legislation. Then you combine that with stuff from other videos. Potentially you could have a paragraph on that they should be elected and a paragraph on reforming the appointments process. So yeah, let me know in the comment section below if you've got any questions or comments or anything I can help with. As I said at the start of the video, you can find the PDF you can see up there on the first link in the description to the Politics Explained website. There's also a lot of essay plans and other resources to help you in your politics A level, as well as a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in. So yeah, thank you very much.